Hi, welcome everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mazviita Chirimuuta. Mazviita Chirimuuta is a professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. And she, even though she's a philosophy professor, she has in fact a PhD in neuroscience, after which she got a postdoc in philosophy and has since drifted into the philosophy direction, but with a very firm footing, as we will see, and as the title suggests in neuroscience. So without further ado, over.
Thank you, Susanna. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here today to present some work. It's actually my first visit to Rutgers campus, so it's been really lovely to meet plenty of people who I've heard about before but never met in person. So yeah, so I'll get on with the talk. So this is some work that's come out of a new sort of bigger project, which I'm at the early stages of what will hopefully be a book soon about explanation in neuroscience. And I'm focusing on particular in the way that neuroscientists simplify the brain. So the kinds of abstractions and idealizations that enable neuroscientists to build computational models of the brain, and then how these should be interpreted philosophically. So I've been thinking for a while about, what are the commitments of computational neuroscience? Does the fact that computationalism is the dominant framework in theoretical neuroscience imply that neuroscientists think the brain is a computer and that we should think the brain is a kind of computer? The first couple of slides just sort of locate the issues here. So this is a quotation from a recent book called The Future of the Brain, where these neuroscientists are just saying the brain is not a laptop, but presumably it is an information processor of some kind, taking in inputs from the world and transforming them into models of the world and instructions to the motor systems that control our bodies and our voices. Our hope is that computation can provide a universal language for describing the action of the brain. And this is a picture from a textbook, so there's this input-output commitment. Oren Shagrir is one philosopher who's sort of recently written about the brain as an input-output model of the world, I believe is the title. So that's the kind of ballpark. I'm also interested in how these ideas have developed historically. So a lot is traced back to McCulloch and Pitts, 1943, a logical calculus of ideas immanent in nervous activity, where they're describing afferents, inputs, and outputs, and of giving a formalism by which you can think of the brain as a kind of Turing machine, and also famously showing how small circuits of neurons considered with these kinds of abstractions can be thought of as AND gates or OR gates. So this is the outline of the talk. So the first part is kind of general with lots of historical reflections as well, but it's looking at this question of why did neuroscience converge on this computational approach to the brain? And obviously with these kinds of questions, there are multiple answers that one can give, but as I said, the issue I'm particularly focused on is how it allows you to simplify the brain. And then second part is, given that we have this computational theory of neuronal function in place, how should we interpret this? So I think of it almost as analogous to questions of interpretation in the philosophy of physics, where we have the science has worked out this theory, then we as philosophers are asking, how should we interpret what the science is telling us about the brain? So what I call the literal one is the more, I think, common interpretation now. So I'm presenting this an analogical interpretation as an alternative to that, pointing out briefly parts 3 and 4 are fairly brief, but at least to motivate why you might want to look for an alternative, and then saying more about sort of the bigger picture avenues that would lead from the analogical interpretation. So, onto this thing of simplification. So if you work in computational neuroscience as opposed to the neurobiology, it's really easy to forget how complicated and messy the brain is in all of its anatomical and physiological detail. So this is just an electron micrograph of brain cells, but you can see there's all this kind of dense tissue and tangle of fibers that if you then conceptualize the neuron's connectivity as a circuit, which is still typical in computational neuroscience. So you're abstracting away from all of that tangled anatomical structure. And this is something that was commented upon as one of the payoffs of the McCulloch and Pitts approach. So this is from the introduction of McCulloch's Embodiment of Mind book, where the author writes, the liberating effect of the mode of thinking characteristic of the McCulloch and Pitts theory can be felt on two levels. On the local level, it eliminates all consideration of the detailed biology of individual cells from the problem of understanding the integrative behavior of the nervous system. And this is done by postulating a hypothetical species of neuron defined entirely by the computation of an output as a logical function of a restricted set of inputs, neurons. So, yeah, that's just elsewhere in this introduction, people are pointing out that, you know, even at the time, it was really obvious to people that neurons weren't really behaving in the way that is described by this formalism, but nonetheless, people pursued this. So this is the point that we can talk about abstraction as simplification, but there's also this other concept in philosophy of science regarding idealization. So saying things about the natural system that we know are false of that system, but nonetheless, for the purposes of modeling it, it becomes an effective scientific strategy. So this is how I think about these kinds of circuit representations of neurons. This is another slide just reminding us of the kind of things that are left out when we think of individual neurons as input-output computational devices. So there's all of this biochemistry inside the cell, protein transcription, a bunch of things happening, all of the neurochemistry of the synapses, the different structures of different classes of neurons, the biophysics of ion channels. There are some people in neurobiology now saying that this could be incredibly relevant to understanding, especially plasticity, and there's a whole load of interest about sort of information and processing at the synapse level, but all of this is abstracted away from in the classic account of neurons and tends to be regarded as the metabolic support, which allows information processing, which is, if you like, the real function of the neurons to take place. So another way that the computational, or as I say here, engineer's perspective is beneficial in neuroscience is that this process of building artificial systems, which share some particular capacities with the biological systems, gives you clues when you're reverse engineering the actual brain. It gives you clues about how biology might have solved some problems in the same way that the artificial system has solved them. And so this goes back to, you know, the golden era of cybernetics in the 1950s and 60s. And this was Jerome Letvin, one well-known neurophysiologist, saying that, you know, we really need to know what to look for in the brain, given that there are just so many different phenomena, so many different ways that you can experimentally manipulate the brain. We need clues about what is functionally relevant, and artificial systems can give you clues to that. So artificial systems, not robots we're talking about here, but computational models of the sort you find in artificial intelligence or machine vision, say, would be the relevant sources. And one thing that I've written about elsewhere a bit more is the way that the computational perspective on the brain is complementary to the mechanistic perspective on the brain. So a lot of work in philosophy of neuroscience right now is focused on mechanistic explanations. So as I say here, causal explanations of neurons and circuits, which are sort of similar to other ways we explain things in biology, but basically applying sort of chemical and physical concepts. It gives you a very sort of reductionistic nuts and bolts approach to what's going on in the brain. But there's also this design stance that you can take on the brain, where you're actually looking at things in terms of, okay, here's a circuit, what is its use or purpose or function? It brings in ideas about, optimality modeling as well. And I associate that with computational neuroscience. And I think the two perspectives on the brain are actually very complementary. Because again, the computational perspective gives you this idea of what to look for. And there's an interesting parallel here with how, biologists like Jerome Letvin and also someone like Ernst Mayr writing at the same time, saying that we can only go so far in biology by treating a living system as a biochemical system, unless we think of it as adapted for certain things, and so introduce the notion of function, then we're just going to be lost in all the details. So that's consistent here. And this is one neurologist, again, a historical quotation, as Francis Walsh puts it: "The modern student finds it difficult to see the wood for the trees. He does not always have a synoptic concept of the nervous system in his mind. If we subject a clock to minute analysis by the methods of physics and chemistry, we shall learn a great deal about its constituents, but we shall not discover its operational principles. That is what makes these constituents function as a clock. Physics and chemistry are not competent to answer questions of this order, which are an engineer's task. Both modes have their place and limitations, and they complement one another." And I think this links to what we see still in contemporary neuroscience. So this is Matteo Carandini, who is a neurophysiologist who has been promoting this idea of canonical neural computations. And he says, the main motivation for needing computational theory in neuroscience, as he puts it, this bridge between the circuits, the pictures of neurons and their activity, and observable behavior of animals. But you can't look at traces of neural activity and figure out how it is that the mouse knows to navigate around the house to find its cheese. So drawing on Ma's 3 levels of description, he's saying that this intermediate level is really crucial to enabling neuroscience really to tell us anything about behavior, which is ultimately what we're interested in when we're studying the brain. So this has all been about, the centrality of computational ideas in neuroscience. Then the question is your brain a computer? So moving from just the historical overview and some broader motivation things, comparing what I call a literal interpretation of the models with this analogical one. So I would say that the literal interpretation is fairly dominant within computational neuroscience. And I would say philosophers of mind who work on the topic as well. So the brain is a sui generis kind of computer. Your brain is not like your laptop, but it is a computer of its own sort. It's consistent with machine functionalism and computational theory of mind, though neuroscientists themselves don't go in for talking about those topics, but it sort of can be seen as related to that. And for reasons I'll explain later, I call this formal realism. The analogical interpretation doesn't say anything more that the brain is in some very significant but limited ways like a computer, and there is this vagueness around what this similarity relationship is. I don't think it fits in with any standard theory in the philosophy of mind. But I'll contrast it with the formal realism by calling it formal idealism, again for reasons I'll explain in a moment. So this is just giving a pictorial representation of the contrast. So for the literal interpretation, you have this genus of computing systems. So you have the meat machine, and then you have electronic computers, and you also have mechanical devices like a Babbage kind of analytical engine. They're all kinds of computing systems. They all work in different ways, different material, but the key thing is that they're information processors which take input from the world and compute things and send outputs. On the analogical side, what we're saying is that there is a selective similarity between the brain and artificial man-made computing systems. It's important, like critical for me to be able to make this distinction. That analogy here does not presuppose isomorphism. So if you thought that all it means to propose an analogy is to say that there is some structure in the source of the analogy which is isomorphic with a structure in the target of the analogy, then that would boil down to a kind of literal interpretation in which the structure is just the mathematical function which is implemented in both systems. So that's not what I mean by analogy here. It's importantly different. Okay. So why call this formal realism? So this terminology, this way of thinking about things actually goes back to Aristotle. So where you have a hylomorphic notion of substances as some interesting, of things, not substances, but this interesting combination of form and matter. So Putnam and Nussbaum, when they were proposing functionalism a few decades ago, they really emphasized this Aristotelian aspect to the view, that they were seeing this functionalism today as just, updating that Aristotelian idea. So the new version of this is that, the forms are the functions, be they biological adaptive ones and mathematical ones. And in computational neuroscience, we should really think of function as being, as signifying both of these things at once. So it assumes that, a circuit that performs a mathematical function which allows you to detect bright spots has also adapted to that, not necessarily evolutionarily, but also in developmental history. It has that function of doing that. It goes better for you, and so I think that when people are within computational neuroscience, even though people can't, always tell adaptational stories about the things that they're investigated, it's at the back of their minds that these are also biologically functional in that sense. And they're realized, so these functions are just realized in neural tissue. So this gives you the picture where the brain/mind is this hylomorphic combination of computational form with the neurobiological matter. So all the cellular tissue which is actually implementing these computational forms. So this is just a quotation from Piccinini and Chagrier, which I think is consistent with this formal realism. So nervous systems process information by performing computations, and that computation must be characterized by abstracting away from certain aspects of the physical system. So the nervous system is really performing these computations. It's a real feature of the nervous system, and it can be described in full abstraction from the neurobiological matter. So an implication of this is multiple realizability, and certainly people like Polger and Shapiro today are saying that, well, as a matter of empirical fact, we're not finding multiple realizations, so maybe there's something wrong with this whole picture. I'm not really sure what to make of that debate. I'm sure with this audience, people have much more sophisticated things to say about that. But one thing I do emphasize about this picture of computation, the computational brain, is it comes with more metaphysical commitments. So it's more committed than the view that I'll propose as an alternative, which is kind of just much more metaphysically agnostic about things. So, this one, I switched to Keynote, but one thing I don't like is that when you go back on an animated slide, anyway, it's just one little glitch. So I'm going to first illustrate this analogical interpretation with a few cases which give you a feel for how I'm interpreting the things, and then sort of lay out the view in a more stepwise way. So the first example is from recent work by some neuroscientists at Stanford, which is trying to understand how it is that primates can do context-dependent perceptual decision-making. So in their experiments, they had monkeys that were trained to respond either to the color of the stimulus or the direction of motion of stimulus. But each stimulus had information on either of those two dimensions. So depending on the cue, the monkey had to select from their perceptual input what was relevant to their decision-making. So it's quite a complex task. And it's believed that prefrontal cortex is the neural substrate for this kind of decision-making. And so they had neural data recorded from PFC, prefrontal cortex, while the monkeys were performing this task. So in that sort of Carandini type picture, what they have is the neural data. They knew how that, they were recording from like hundreds of neurons at a time. So they had loads of data on how the neurons were spiking at each moment during the trial. And they have the behavioral data about on which trials the monkeys got the correct answer and the reaction times, everything like that. But they didn't have the story to tell about, how the neuron spikings give you the behavior, looking at the monkeys by themselves. So really the computational modeling really comes in as the bridge there. And what they do specifically is that they built a recurrent neural network, which was trained to solve a simulated version of this decision-making task. So that's just represented there. You can see it's got the sensory input going in there. It's just trained over lots of trials. Then eventually you've got a trained system which will solve the task. And so what they do then is look for similarities between this RNN model, which is the analog source, and the prefrontal cortex. So there are certain similarities. So both can solve this task. One of the things that they were particularly interested in is whether the sensory information from the irrelevant stimulus dimension is represented in the population as late as prefrontal cortex. And they find that it is in their neural data. And they also find that it's there in the model as well. So it's not thrown out in this early gating hypothesis. They're able to do some data analysis on the actual neural data and also the, if you like, the simulated neurons in their model. And in this, they find an important similarity, which is that on this 3D state space, you can interpret there being a axis for each stimulus dimension and also for this dimension of choice. So they find lots of similarities. So this pattern of analogical reasoning goes from seeing two systems, the source and the target. The source you know more about, the target has more unknowns. And if you, seeing that the pattern of reasoning goes that if you see enough relevant similarities, then it allows you to say, to make a reasonable inference. It's not, there are reasons, it's reasonable inference for the purposes of science to say, well, their explanation of how it is that the model does this task is that they do this with very fancy reverse engineering of their RNN, and they find this thing called a line attractor, which is a way for the network to integrate information about sensory information that's coming in, which would solve the task. So they're saying that's how the model solves the problem, and their bet is that that's also what's going on in the prefrontal cortex. So the thing about having the model solve the task is that even though the model is not transparent to the researchers, they haven't hand-coded the solution of the task into the model, but it's a trained model and then they have to reverse engineer it. But even then, it's more accessible to reverse engineering than the actual brain. So knowing something about how the model does it is at least a very good clue to how the actual brain does it. And if you read the paper itself, they kind of present it as they're pretty sure that this is also what's going on in the prefrontal cortex. But I feel like my interpretation of this more as a philosopher is that this is a reasonable similarity that you're entitled to infer that this is probably what's going on in the brain as well. But I call it a prospective use of analogy because really you should treat that as a hypothesis for further investigation as opposed to like we've found the precise answer here. Okay, so now move on to a sort of classic piece of computational neuroscience made famous by David Marr, and various people, including Frank Egan, have written about this case. So I call it an abstractive use of analogy because it's ultimately allowing you to make inferences about what is not relevant for a particular task. But the task here is edge detection. So say it's a black and white photograph. How do you find out what the edges are? The computational solution to this proposed by Marr is to convolve the photograph with a Laplacian of Gaussian filter. And it was noted at the time that there are cells in the early visual system, the retina and lateral geniculate nucleus, whose receptive fields have at least visualizable similarities with the Laplacian of Gaussian filters. So this seemed like a highly relevant comparison to make. And so in arguing that, so Marr himself is a literalist. He says that what these neurons are doing is really computing the Laplacian of Gaussian filters. But like I'm taking a step back and sort of thinking about another way to interpret this. So I'm kind of giving you my own take of this, which is just to say that what Marr presents us with is a nice set of similarities, which you can compare the model's output with the neuronal output. So what you see here, these lines are how the model would respond to an edge, thin bar, wide bar. So, and these, I've added here the visual stimuli that would be shown in a neurophysiology experiment to these particular cells. And these are the neuronal traces which you see here. So Marr actually takes these traces from some papers that were recent at the time. So we've got these comparisons. So what can we infer analogically from that? So here's, on the one hand, you've got your source. I'm calling it a computer, but really I'm just referring to the Laplacian of Gaussian model. So we're looking at inferred similarities. So I'm saying, well, both can detect edges, And you see this comparable characteristic patterns of peaks on the onset and offset of the edges. So you saw that in the last slide, that there were these observable similarities there. Also particularly important for this pattern of reasoning is that you note the dissimilarities. So in particular, one's implemented in a computer, one's an electrically excitable cell. So I'm inferring that these neurons can be modeled as computing these functions. Ma himself said they are really computing these functions, but I'm having a less committal interpretation. But particularly relevant to Ma, and he did infer this, is that the differences in implementation are not relevant to the function here investigated. So showing the similarity in capacity and showing that there are some similarities in the more fine-grained behaviors of the system. So not just that it detects edges, but the units in the system seem to be performing some similar, trying to express it in a way which is not too literal, but that just basically what you saw in the last slide, that there are some sort of local responses which have this nice correspondence between the two. So it allows you to say, yeah, I mean, if we describe it in those mathematical terms, at that, as what Mark called the computational level of description, then all of that neurobiological stuff is really not relevant to explaining this capacity. So that's the key abstractive inference here. Okay, so I'll say more about this proposed analogical interpretation here and why I call it formal idealism. So one line of Kant interpretation, and here I'm very much influenced by my colleague in Pittsburgh, Stephen Engstrom. So one line of Kant interpretation takes Kant as picking up on Aristotelian hylomorphism, but really dispensing with the idea that the form is out there in the things, and interpreting the form as something brought by the cognizing subjects to the matter of sensory input. So picking up on this idea, so saying that, you know, okay, so if standard functionalism was inspired by Aristotle, then you might have a Kantian version of functionalism, if you like, just to use terms loosely. So in this case, we can think of the form, the patterns in the mathematical structures in the system as sort of brought by the scientist to the subject matter. So you think of the forms as mathematical structures projected. I put scare quotes here because that's not a good Kantian way of thinking about things, but it sort of gets you into maybe expresses what I'm trying to say. So these mathematical structures are projected onto the neural data during the process of abstraction. So the idea is that we're looking at all this neural data, so the LGN receptive fields and all of that, and we're finding that in our artificial system we've got something that's doing these Laplacian of Gaussians, and we're kind of projecting what we've learned from the artificial context onto the neural system. Right? So this is agnostic about whether the brain by itself is really a computational system, but it's saying for the purposes of doing this computational neuroscience, we'll just treat this as sort of what's going on in the brain. And it's agnostic about multiple realizability. So it's not committed to saying that like the essence of what the brain is doing is computing this function, and therefore we could recreate the essence of the cognition that the brain is doing in an artificial system. So it's just not coming with those commitments. So one reason that I think we should kind of explore this less literal way of interpreting the things, and why we should move away from thinking that we've sort of discovered, when we're doing computational modeling of neural system, that we've really discovered the inherent mathematical structure, or the inherent functions that are computed there. So one reason why I think we should move away from that is just thinking about the latitude that scientists have when they're going from like the messy data that the brain generates into building kind of clean and neat computational models. So when you're doing neurophysiology, there's loads of different ways of processing the signals and averaging the data and doing dimensionality reduction as well. That's just very popular now. And so there are many steps that you can go from those data to the, if you like, the nice cleaned up patterns, which are what's embodied in the model. And so I'm saying it's just too much of a leap to say that you've really found the inherent structures that are there in the brain. So this is just saying, so whenever you're doing an experiment, you have to kind of clean away all of what gets classified as noise, and then that you see kind of things in the data which suggest patterns, or if you like, computations, but then there is this interpretative work that goes on. You might sort of interpolate in one way, and you get sort of a downward pointing triangle, but there's also something in the data that suggests an upward pointing triangle. So you might say, well, that's really the what's going on in the system, what's computed in the system. So this is just like a illustration of the idea. But I think a real instance of it is actually if you look at Ma's proposal, and you look at the neglected structures which is there in the neural data, which is just not captured by his model, but he really doesn't draw attention to this at all. So there's this asymmetry in the neuronal responses to light and dark edges. So if you take the neuron here, and it's in a dark area, and then a light bar sweeps over it, you get a higher response than if the neuron is in the light area and then a dark bar sweeps over it. You see that response is much lower. And on these sides, you see this peak is much higher than this peak, and vice versa. So you see that there are these asymmetries there, which just aren't at all a feature of the Laplacian of Gaussianness. And it's not even commented on by Ma. But if you look at the original papers, these asymmetries really leap out at you. And I'm not saying that Ma did anything dishonest or even disingenuous, but I'm just pointing out that any time a theoretician is confronted by sort of the actual data, data coming from a biological system, there's so much more richness and complexity in the system that it would even make sense to try and model all of these features in the data. So you have to sort of come at it with a hypothesis about like what the really relevant structures are and capture those in the model. And for Ma, he just didn't think this asymmetry was even a relevant feature. Some other theoretician might have done. And so, what we see in neuroscience today is there's just an explosion of ways of data collecting, ways of data processing, and also models of ways of modeling identical systems. So they don't, and I think this stems down to this, there's actually a fair amount of latitude. Whenever you're dealing with a complex system in biology, there's a fair amount of latitude in what you consider the relevant features of it to be, and therefore what goes into your theory of it. Okay. So that's the picture. So I'd say the main feature of the analogical interpretation that I'm proposing is that it comes with fewer commitments, sort of metaphysical commitments. So I'll just gesture at some of the ones in the literal interpretation that you might find problematic. So one feature of the literal interpretation is that it comes with this picture of what cognition is, which is pretty much abstracted from biology. So what I'm calling a bug, you might call a feature. I don't know about that, but that's one way of looking at it. But I would say what has happened in research on cognition is that there has been a neglect of the disanalogies between computers and brains to an extent that you see there's been a relative neglect of the features of biological systems that are just not really there in the computational ones. So the inherent plasticity of biological tissue, this is something people like Eve Marder have been sort of talking about for years, and it's really fascinating work by showing that, you know, it's in the nature of metabolizing cells to change their structure and just how they're constituted in the course of metabolizing. So there's an inherent instability to biological tissue, which is not there in man-made devices like this laptop, which is engineered to stay structurally the same as long as it runs and then it breaks. Whereas living systems are constantly changing their material constitution, but they have to be functionally robust. So the idea out there is that, you know, learning in real brains is just piggybacked off the inherent plasticity and robustness of biological tissue. So there's something like deeply important about this changeability of biological tissue for explaining learning and plasticity in biological systems. So Peter Godfrey-Smith is one philosopher who's been talking about this, and I think it's a really important idea. Embodiment is something that has been talked about by plenty of people in the sort of embodied cognition field, and I don't know how deep those kinds of points are, but yeah, it's still certainly out there. One thing that I've noticed about in this recent explosion of advances in AI, there have been a lot of wild claims made about how, you know, general AI is going to be sort of just developing straightforward out of the expert systems, which we have seen sort of rapid advances in recently. Plenty of people, and I'm not talking about philosophers here really, but there's plenty of people in California that talk about uploading and post-biological intelligence. And yeah, I'm not trying to like castigate a philosophical view by saying that, well, it leads to this bad thing, because that wouldn't be fair. But I think there are certain dangers around this literal interpretation, because it has been, I think it just has been taken too literally that, you know, your brain is so much a kind of computer that we just need to sort of work out what the software is and then run it on the hardware. But what I would say is the mistake here is this extrapolation from showing that there's an equivalence in the ability to do a very narrowly defined and specific task, and then thinking, oh, because you've worked out how it does that very narrowly defined specific task, then you've really worked out how the system is doing everything. And I think that is the mistake here. So when people, you know, when AlphaGo, you know, beat Lee Sedol, people are saying, we're going to see how next year. But I don't think that's going to happen, because it's like saying that, you know, when we invented a car that could drive on a straight road much, much faster than a horse, inferring that the car could leap over a log. It's just going well beyond the narrowly defined function that you've engineered the system to do. So it's certainly, I think, possible to hold more to the literal interpretation and then be aware that, okay, we've worked out how the system does this other task, and just be more aware that there are way more other tasks out there which we haven't found the computational solutions for. But I think people have been less cautious there than they should do. So I think outside of philosophy, the prevalence of this sort of computational literalism has been part of the boom and bust cycles that we see in AI. That people think we're just going to solve everything because we've solved something. Okay. So the next couple of slides, I'm just sort of gesturing to what I think some of the implications are for the less literal and more analogical view would be. So just stepping back into the historical reflections now. One of the people that I've been reading in the course of thinking about abstraction in science more generally is Whitehead, because he had this notion of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that if you don't take seriously the way that science abstracts from so many different observable qualities that are there in the systems that we're observing and measuring, and then moves on to very abstract mathematical models. If you don't remember that in the process of building a scientific model, you've left out so many of the details that are there in nature, then you can be caught up in these sort of philosophical problems. So, well, how is it that our abstract mathematical picture of the world doesn't explain all these other things that seem to be there in nature? So he actually thought about this fallacy of misplaced concreteness as the source of mind-body problems in philosophy in recent years. So I thought that's a really interesting idea. And so I've been thinking about how this sort of diagnosis of philosophical problems would then apply to the computational brain. So I argued at the outset today that computational models of the brain are powerful abstractions which permit neuroscientists to ignore countless biological details. But the point I was making, that what it allows you to infer is that the biological details are not relevant to quite narrowly defined tasks, but not irrelevant to cognition, to core. So on the analogical interpretation of computational models, you'd expect as many disanalogies as analogies between brains and computational systems. So I'm not saying that it would have to be like that in nature. I mean, it could be that there were more analogies than disanalogies. But I think once you move into this way of thinking about things, that the disanalogies become sort of more salient to you. So you're seeing this way of interpreting the neuroscience is saying that, okay, whenever a neuroscientist is confronted with messy neural data and then has to model that, they are going to be making choices about what goes into the model, and they're going to be having to ignore plenty of dissimilarities between what's there in the neural system and what can actually be represented in the model. So the comparison is that on the literal interpretation, think of computation as the essence of the brain's cognitive capacities. And so rather than just saying, well, we happen to have left these details of the model because we needed to, you end up saying that these disanalogous features are just kind of mere metabolic support. You're just saying that it's not relevant to cognition. That's kind of typically what's done. So just to illustrate this, we have artificial computational systems which perform some equivalent functions without the sentience found in animals. So say, we do visual object recognition and we actually sort of sentiently see the things that we're looking at. A deep neural network can do visual object recognition without sentience, So what we have is a computational explanation of visual object recognition. On the literal interpretation, you then have this sort of explanatory leftover thing about, well, we've explained visual object recognition, but there's this sentience in animals, and that's kind of what's going on with that then. It's like we've got this leftover bit, which is problematic, because it seems like we've fully explained the capacity, visual object recognition, but then there's this thing that animals have and the computers don't, and then that's just there that's problematic. On the analogical interpretation, this is the contrast, it's clear that it's a precondition of the explanatory framework that visual sentience is irrelevant for the explanation of visual object recognition. So the whole point of this framework is that you're drawing on comparisons between computers and animals. Computers, don't have sentience, animals do, but in virtue of choosing a framework in which the in which you have an analog source, which is non-sentient, and an analog target, which you're just trying to explain one in terms of the others, you're saying at the outset, for the purposes of this explanation, we're just going to have to bracket sentience. And I'm saying that this is sort of just implicit but deep within this framework. But then if you then try and, as philosophers, sort of use this framework to try and understand all of the things that philosophers are interested in, like sentience, then you're just not going to get anywhere, and you're just going to be left with these unexplained things. So, hope that's clear. Okay. So anyway, this is just sort of sketching out an argument as to why, if you move to this analogical interpretation, then some of the limitations and problems around trying to work out what's going on with the brain understood computationally, you'll just see, well, it's kind of just built into the framework, and it's less puzzling, I hope, if we see it that way. Yeah, so this is to finish up. So I finish up with this. Okay, so just to summarize, if you buy into this analogical interpretation, you're no longer saying that computation is the essence of biological intelligence. You're saying that you shouldn't extrapolate beyond narrow functional equivalences, so from visual object recognition to vision in general, from non-sentient object recognition to sentient object recognition, that you are so you're locked into just talking about what we know about quite narrowly defined tasks. So it's being suggested by what I'm saying, and I think this is something that needs to be explored further, is that the details of neuronal realization probably do matter if you're going to sort of try and work out what's going on beyond the capacities for which you see the narrow functional equivalence with computers. So I see that as a thing that neuroscientists would just have to sort of work more on. So seeing, looking at their computational models as sort of suggesting in an abstract way what might be going on in the biological systems, but realizing that having a sort of simplified and narrowly construed computational description is going to be probably going to be limiting their view to not thinking about all kinds of other phenomena that are there in biology that might be really relevant to explaining intelligence more generally, or cognition in general. So this just concludes with this concept from Leibniz, who was thinking about this mechanistic worldview as it was back then, and thinking of the limitations of that. And so saying, maybe everything in biology is just a mechanism, but if you compare like biological systems with man-made systems, maybe the mechanistic structure sort of goes way down in biology to infinite complexity, which puts limitations on how much we can understand by just drawing explicit comparisons between artificial machines and, as he called it, divine machines. So for him, he thought, well, maybe the details do matter. I should just clarify at this point, I'm not saying that we should go back to sort of mechanistic philosophy of neuroscience as it's been construed recently. What I'm saying is that like the computational perspective in neuroscience as it's been done so far is all well and good, but we should sort of acknowledge the limitations of that. And yeah, it all becomes more complicated, but maybe the details do matter. So that's it.
Okay, so we have half an hour for Q&A, and please raise your hand if you have a question. Frankie, why don't you start?
Thank you. So I'm wondering whether the real moral is that we should just be more cautious in saying that so leaving aside kind of claims like the brain is a computer and focusing on what's the best interpretation of specific computational models. Maybe we should be more cautious in concluding that this is what the brain is actually doing. It's actually computing Laplacian and Gaussian or integration or whatever. And I think that that's right. And so Mara probably got it wrong. Kind of early days in the project, maybe that's to be expected. But what I'm unclear on is what that's kind of the models are defeasible. Where their theories are extrapolating from the data. You don't want to be too hasty about that. But what is kind of your bottom line? Yeah, how should we understand the claim that this mechanism is computing Laplacian and Gaussian? Should we be fictionalists about that? And then if we are, so if we take on board kind of the analogical interpretation, this is kind of the second part of the question. What happens? True, the account isn't going to explain everything. So visual sentience, it's not going to doesn't even try to say anything about that. But what about the core kind of explanatum is visual competence or visual object recognition? On the analogical interpretation, do we really get an explanation of that capacity?
Right. Yeah. So just on the first point there. So I think so the story here is that we should be more cautious in interpretation of specific things. But then if we do that, the bigger picture things of the brain being a computer, I took them to be motivated by the local successors. So I think that's why it's relevant to those bigger picture claims there. And so what does the analogical interpretation get you? So this is sort of part of the bigger project, which I think it can't help but think sort of the bigger picture notion of what's being explained here is some kind of Kantian pluralism, where we have the system in nature which is terribly, terribly complicated, and then we abstract away from it in taking these different perspectives, and we get explanations of like the reduced behavior of the system, the simplified behavior, say that an animal performs in a lab, or the cleaned up neural data. So we can explain, if you like, the simplified phenomena, but there is still a gap, a mismatch between that and, if you like, the total thing in nature. But any one simplifying perspective is sort of complemented by other perspectives. So if you wanted to say that ultimately we get an explanation, it would only be by sort of by triangulating across a bunch of different views on the thing in nature.
Just a quick follow-up. So then, what do you get? So if you're careful at the beginning, say what the explanatum is. It's detecting edges, and you posit computation,
Right.
then what, I mean, I'm still not clear on what do you get an explanation of that if on the analogical perspective?
Yeah, so at most you could
The
say...
literalist is going to say it's doing this by computing the busing and realism.
Right, so I don't... Yeah, so, I mean, I hesitate saying that. So given that there are sort of now, since Marx, sort of multiple models of what those neurons are doing, it seems like, you can't be sure that any one neuron is, any one neural system, that's like, we found the true function that it's doing. But assume that we could, assume that there were no rival models of those receptive fields. I would say that the most you would want to say on this interpretation is that for those narrowly defined functions and for the phenomenon that you can elicit in a laboratory context, that this is a good model of that. But you should always be aware of the artifice that goes into the experimental setup, how you elicit the behavior from the neurons. And then also the...
which is, of course, a feature of any...
Right. And the latitude that the scientist has in sort of processing their data and selecting which patterns in the data will then be modeled. So that those, if you like, these choices of the scientists and the artifice of the setup is sort of an ineliminable part of the explanation that you get at the end of it. That's like the bigger picture thing in the background.
It sounds like you're pretty pessimistic.
Does that sound pessimistic? Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Brian, do you want to do one?
Just a quick follow-up. So Jerry Fodor thought you can give a kind of reductive explanation of mental abilities in terms of computational abilities.
Right.
But then he was quick to point out when he pressed him that this won't work for abilities that essentially involve phenomenal consciousness.
Right.
Just phenomenal consciousness can't be explained this way.
Yeah.
So you've kind of bracketed off phenomenal consciousness too.
Yeah.
But the question I took Frank to be asking is, but do you get really reductive explanation of the mental abilities that don't involve, essentially involve phenomenal consciousness? And I took it the worry was, it looks like you view a computation as a kind of design stance. It's a kind of stance field.
Right. Yeah.
So we take a certain kind of design stance towards something, we try to explain it.
Yeah.
And then the worry about that is, the individuals taking the divine stance have mental abilities. So you're not reducing even that other aspect of mentality. There's no reduction involved.
Yeah.
So do you agree there's no explanatory reduction involved?
Yeah. So I would.
So that's what you kind of use deflation.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm not saying. So I'm not taking like another stance to be more fundamental to this stance. How I'm thinking about this pluralism is that each of these different perspectives are on the same level, and they're each trying to get an insight into the system and nature, but each perspective comes with its own blind spot. So it's not like reductive neurobiology trumps the design stance. I really do think that they're deeply interdependent in some way.
That's a Kantian pluralism.
Yeah, that's what I would call that. Yeah.
Matthew Stone.
Hi. So, I think the point is well taken about the sort of limitations of modeling.
Right.
But I wanted to sort of maybe press a little bit about whether there are alternatives to computational models and whether that was important. So there's a long tradition in cognitive science and philosophy, like people like Andy Clark, trying to trying to say that like dynamical systems views are going to provide alternatives to computational views with things like in virtue of the continuous processes that are involved in things like this laws. On the other hand, there are people like Randy Gallison here who say no, like when we look at the metabolic mechanisms, they're going to turn out to be digital and computational as well. I wasn't really sure how whether you thought that it's going to be important to have other kinds of explanations besides computational ones in the neuroscience or not, and how much, there's just a recognition of the limitations of the computational approach, which, by the way, apply to your laptop just as well. It doesn't have infinite memory.
So, like I said, presenting this to say that there's going to be some other picture out there which is going to have all of the features and all of the explanatory potential and none of the blind spots of computationalism. So I don't think I actually had another paper where I'm talking about dynamical systems versus standard computational models of motor cortex, and I'm saying that each of these has to make certain assumptions, and so each has its own limitations, but it's not like you're going to say one is better than the other, but for certain purposes it makes sense to make these abstractions and not the other abstractions. So so does that, you saying that that's not really answering your question? Or you're looking like it doesn't really answer your question. So yeah, so this.
I mean, it's
That's just the way he looks.
Okay.
I mean, you're welcome to come back.
It just looks like that.
Okay.
want to, I mean, yeah, for sort of substantiating those details, I think is an important
Right.
part of telling working scientists to open the kinds of
Right.
models that they're considering.
Yeah. Okay. So it's my point of recommendation to working scientists. Not even that. It's really a question about how we interpret the science that is out there today for the purposes of doing philosophy of mind, and it's just a point about there being too little attention being paid to the inherent built-in limitations of each modelling framework. I think just a note of caution on that.
Paul Wachowski.
Thanks. So, pressing the Randy Gallisol.
Uh-huh.
Suppose I've got an animal and I'm convinced it's got some representational capacities, and I have no idea yet how its brain does
Right.
it.
Yeah.
But I'm convinced that the representational capacities involve computation
Right.
in a non-analogical sense.
Right.
Is your thought that for those capacities,
Right.
when we finally figure out, if we do, what's
Right.
working underneath the hood,
Right.
that there will have a computational model that supports a literal interpretation? Or does the pluralism allow for the possibility of literal computations at a cognitive level of description, but only analogical computations at a biological level?
Right. Yeah, so it's a, I don't want to come back to this question with a question, but on this scenario, where does the conviction that what the neurons are really doing is computing?
I didn't say anything about the conviction the neurons will be used. You said the conviction that the representational capacity the neuron has
Right.
involves computations.
Okay.
So, if you want,
Right.
if you want a classic example, like so I've got these two black boxes,
Right.
and this one will generate streams of
Yeah.
A's and B's, and it generates them all of them. This one only generates AB, AABB, AAABBB, so I'm convinced this one's operating at least level 2 of the Chomsky hierarchy.
Right.
And so, look, I have no idea how it's doing it, but I'm convinced that it's got a flavor of recursion that requires some kind of computation.
Right. Yeah, so, yeah, so, I mean, this talk, I mean, it's not about that bridge from neuroscientific phenomena to psychological phenomena. So I don't have anything deep to say about that, other than there's nothing that stands against you taking those psychological phenomena at face value, and it would be a completely different story. I'm not saying that you have to take the analogical interpretations of that to the psychological phenomena at all, but should you, in virtue of seeing those phenomena at the psychological level, infer that they're lower down there in the neurobiology, I'm saying no. Right? So, yeah, I'm saying that if you just look at what the neurons are doing, then we should be more cautious about interpreting them as really computing things.
So just to follow up, right? So there are two things one can say about it.
Right.
One can say either, yes, I'm such a pluralist
Right.
that I'm willing to have real psychological computations that are not implemented by anything
Right.
that's really doing computations. Or, look, if you tell me that in fact I can't find the computations at the neural level, so much the worse for the idea that it was the neural level that was implementing mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so, I mean, you're saying that it implies dualism or something?
No.
Yeah.
There's room at the bottom.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have anything. I'm so like fed up with just sort of generalized like impulse to reduction all the time. I just don't really worry about, whether you're gonna be able to explain minds with neurons at this stage, especially if you just think about how sort of local what neuroscience is telling us is. So I don't think anything that what I said should imply that the psychological picture we have is there's anything wrong with that. What it's saying is that neuroscience right now doesn't have a story to tell about that, which is not to say that one day the picture coming out of neuroscience might be putting all those perspectives together, might be something more generalizable, but saying right now we shouldn't, and we shouldn't paper over the gaps and say that we've got one big coherent story to tell there. So that's, I guess that's it.
Veronica, go on.
Yeah, so you said you thought a virtue of the analogical interpretation is that it's less
Right.
committal.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, when you have a philosophical view, what the science is telling you, what you want is a metaphysical commitment. Like, what you want is to be able to say, okay, we're not doing science right now, but let's just like engage in this exercise. And what should I say about the objective picture of the world that the science is suggesting?
Yeah.
And I feel like in most of the cases when you try to engage in that exercise, you don't really think that you should be confident. Like, you should be very confident that that's the right picture. Like, people doing philosophy of physics might come up with an interpretation of what the fundamental level might be like, even knowing that the theory they started with isn't really the right one. So I was kind of taking a kind of that kind of attitude towards neuroscience, thinking like, look, just the psychological level phenomena and some of the preliminary evidence we have really motivate this very interesting picture of reality. And let's try to work it out. And then the task is to see whether there's kind of a way to see how the modest success that we see would be what you would expect under the limitations that we're actually facing and under like our inability to like measure very precisely and our mathematical limitations.
Yeah, so a virtue of sort of suggesting a big metaphysical picture. Yeah, I guess it goes to this feature bug thing. All I would say is that sort of on paper, maybe that sounds fine, but then if I kind of look at how sort of some of the more wild claims that come out on the basis of, thinking about the computational brain, I think, well, people are just extrapolating from a thin basis. So at the very least, we should be cautious about that process of sort of trying to sort of fill in the gaps where the science hasn't got there yet. I'm not saying that all people that are doing computational literalism are like that, but I'm saying that really in a case-by-case basis, what we have to make a judgment about sort of these philosophical unifying projects, how good they are. But then in another vein, less case-by-case thing, I do wonder, science as an activity is kind of piecemeal, and it's taking the phenomena that it has and sort of, there is this caution inherent in science, is that you shouldn't say really more about the system and nature that you have than you can sort of justify by your data and be always being aware of the limitations of your model. So I would say that science in its own nature is more piecemeal and cautious than philosophers for their own interests would like to recognize. So are we really doing an injustice to the science by saying not only do we need to accept the scientific results as they're published and with all the limitations that the scientists would recognize of that, so are we doing an injustice to the science of saying, but over and above this, there is this like bigger neuroscientific worldview that comes out of it. And so I guess I'm more sort of at the end of the day, I'm more sort of concerned about that it's probably less in the spirit of the science to want to be doing these unifying projects around that.
So, I'm personally very sympathetic to the kind of idealist view of model descriptions of everything, and including of brains. But I mean, for that exact reason, I'm perfectly comfortable saying that the brain is literally a computer, because in the same sense that your laptop is literally a computer, the same as what Matthew alluded to before, that laptops don't really perfectly realize the idealized computational design that they're intended to, and brains certainly don't perfectly realize any particular model. Of course, brains are much more subject to reasonable alternative models than laptops are, because they weren't designed for it. We haven't figured out what models yet. But I mean, to the extent that we can say anything literally follows a model, which I personally don't think we ever literally mean literally.
Okay.
Then that's the sense in which a brain is computer.
Okay.
And to say it even slightly stronger, there's another sense historically why people say that that their brains are literally computers and not only analogical computers, which is because they're, from the Church-Turing thesis, if you accept it, then there really is no kind of broader model to appeal to. So I mean, just take your McCulloch and Pitts example from the beginning of the, if you have an individual neuron which you think is implementing an AND gate, of course, on further inspection, if you consider all the details of the biology, it's probably not literally implementing an AND gate, but if you got a more detailed model of it, we assume, as believers in the Church-Turing thesis, that the more accurate model would still be computational in some more elaborate circuit that took into account some of the biological details. So that's the power that comes from saying it's literally a computer, because that's a kind of a functional description that has a huge explanatory power and a huge predictive power, and really can't be improved in any other way.
Yeah. So if everyone that takes the computation, if everyone that took the computational literalist view had the caveats that you did, then I'd be happy with that, because you're taking on board the limitations of model representation, which is just the point that I'm driving at. But I just don't think, as a matter of fact, that they are, which is why I'm sort of pressing on this. Just this is a correction to how these things have been interpreted. And
I agree with that. You do meet people in neuroscience who have a surprisingly literalist view of this kind of ontology. So I don't know what to do about that. It's a very narrow view of how science works in general, right? I mean, you have the same problem in biology and other areas of science. Where people believe that once a model has been published at p less than 0.01, it is objectively correct.
I mean, so also you were pressing about the superiority of the computational approach to the other ones. So I mean, so what would you say about the youth model type things, about how by taking and Peter Smith is talking about this, by taking the computational approach as the preeminent one, then you're missing out there's all of this changeability in the biological stuff, which might be really important to how animals think.
That stuff is, of course, scientifically important.
Right.
I mean, that shows the inadequacy of any particular model,
right?
But it doesn't show the inadequacy of the computational model as a framework. I mean, but if you have a model of those computations that doesn't take into account, for example, the plasticity, then clearly you're not going to be able to predict a lot of human learning very well.
Yeah. So you weren't saying just then that, with the fancier version of what the neurons are doing, that you would just encompass that, or were you saying that then goes beyond?
No, I'm saying the fancier version you could encompass that in. And I agree with you and others who have said that, existing models may be overly narrow and limited in their assumptions, and I definitely agree with you sociologically that people often take those limitations as if they were.
Yes, please.
So I have what's probably a related point, which is, so towards the beginning of your talk, you were showing us some graphics about a simple circuit and fancy neuron that had lots of stuff in it. And you said, okay, you sort of seem to be hinting that that the circuit was an input-output kind of system.
Yeah.
And you're sort of hinting that that wasn't doing justice to what the neuron was.
Right.
I was wondering, why don't we just look at the neuron as a much fancier input-output system?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sure, it's more complicated than the little circuit, but you take into account everything that's going into it. I suppose it's still an input-output system, and then maybe there's the issue about whether it's a deterministic input-output system or there's something probabilistic in it. And maybe that's a significant difference. But apart from that, it seems like you'd say it's an input-output system and therefore potentially computational, even though it's more complicated.
Yeah. I think there is some. This is not really germane to just as a philosophy talk, but then I worry about, just how much contingency there is in computational neuroscience, just by the kinds of models that people have had and the kinds of things that have been coded for, and then, okay, so people could do all that fancy stuff, that would be fine, but then, sorry, I'm just trying to get my thoughts clear on this, what to say about it. I mean, so what I said at the outset is it's not an accident that our models in computational neuroscience are very simplified and don't take into account all these details. It's precisely because the neuroscientists wanted a framework which was much more simple than could be. And so it would be like, it's a feature of this whole framework that it's making those simplifying assumptions that people knew at the outset were not true of the systems themselves, and then seeing how far they could go under the guise of these simplifying assumptions. And I don't think it's an accident that people always go for the simplest kinds of models that they can get away with, because that's how science works. And what you start to find when you try and just model or simulate more and more complexity, which is what people are doing using artificial neural networks, is that you soon reach models of complexity which you don't understand as the modeler anymore. And so then there becomes this problem, like we could simulate more complexity, but then we haven't actually understood the system better. So I think the virtue of the computational framework, as it was classically done, is that it allowed you to, in virtue of these simplifying assumptions, it allowed you to generate explanatory hypotheses and generate understanding in a way that building more complex models won't do.
Well, I don't know. I suppose too there could be a hypothesis where it's not just convenient to abstract, but there's a sense in which it's right to abstract, right? So maybe people could be right that firing rate is the only thing that's important about a neuron that carries the information.
Right.
Probably it isn't, but it could have been. And so I'm thinking about, like, I have a book on my shelf, and it's got printed words on it, it's got a few ink blots on it.
Right.
And I could say, okay, the information, I could say, okay, the information is in all the letters.
Right.
And somebody could say, hey, that's way oversimplified because you haven't taken into account the ink blots.
Right.
I say, yeah, the ink blots are there, but I shouldn't have taken them into account because that's not what's doing the work, so to speak.
Yeah. And so I think people were betting on that it being in that all of those ink blot details didn't matter so much. But I think the more people have gone into it, it's just, there's this uneasy feeling that some of those details are really, really important, but it's going to be so hard to model them. And that's why I think we end up with this perspectivist view, which is just that you're just going to get partial glimpses with relatively simplified models of aspects of the system, but you're not within one model going to get something that's going to generate all the explanations that, if you were optimistic, you would have wanted.
The alternative could have been that there was one perspective that would have been right. This is what's doing the relevant work. It just wasn't that one.
Yeah. But I doubt that one perspective that is humanly understandable could do that.
Okay, so the next person on the list happens to be myself.
Oh yeah.
So 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 you talked a lot about forms, and with forms you seem they're a kind of function that may or may not be realized in neural tissue.
Right.
And one big distinction between the interpretational, the literal interpretation of the brain as a computer versus the analogical interpretation is that, to the literal interpretation, the functions are out in nature, they're actually there to be found, whereas on the analogical interpretation, the scientists sort of attribute to the function.
Right.
And the way you put that seemed to be, I mean, you favored the analogical interpretation. You seem to favor it in part because of that feature.
Yeah.
But that seems sort of surprising to me, and so I wanted to hear a bit more about why that seems like a good thing, because I would assume the brain has, the neural networks have all these functions, they're there to be found, and I see no good reason to deny that, and no good reason to think. I mean, of course, sometimes we attribute functions to the brain that it doesn't in fact have. I mean, fair enough, but I thought, the goal is to sort of discover the functions, and it seems, I don't see any good reason to reject them.
Yeah. So one of the reasons sort of I've shifted to this view is taking examples, and I mentioned briefly the motor cortex one, just systems where you afford styles of modeling and therefore functional attributions which are just radically opposed to each other. So in that, and each kind of modeling has its own justification and inherent scientific interest and potential technological application, but they can't both be right. And so I suppose just rather than dogmatically saying, well, that must be right and the other is wrong, I'm saying, well, the brain is such complexity that it affords these different attributions, but we should hesitate to think that any one attribution is sort of getting to what's really going on in the brain. You could say that, okay, what's really going on in the brain is just the aggregate of every kind of attribution that is there. But why I hesitate to that is just because it seems that certain choices that the scientists made, these idealizing assumptions, are built into each kind of modeling style or functional attribution, such that, we can't just say that we're just capturing a selective portion of what's really there in the brain. We're certainly inputting something, I would say, on the scientist side.
I see. So you're not denying that the brain has functions on its own accord, but when you speak of functions or forms, you have this sort of interpretational understanding of what they are, and while there may also be some functions out there to be discovered, there's always this interpretation.
Right. So so the official view is that we're just agnostic about what, whether the brain by itself is really computing. So what we can say is always through the filter of our models. So,
On that note, let's thank Mazviita.